Hello, Master Trees and others. This is Saving the Bees One Garden at a Time, a presentation about pollinating in your garden, presented by me. My name is Linda Reavley. I am a master gardener and also a beekeeper. I live in Tuolumne County, and I have been active with master gardeners in Tuolumne County since 2012. So I have a fair amount of time in with master gardeners, but much longer with bees. I've been keeping bees since the late 1970s. People frequently ask about why we should save the bees. Well, since we know that 70 to 75% of our food is pollinated by insects, and in the United States, that means both European honeybees, which are not native to the United States, and our native insect pollinators and other pollinators, we can see that bees are really important. We can't live on wine and beer alone, but neither wine or beer require bees or any other pollinator because the wind pollinates them. We don't really understand the complex relationships between plants and animals. Plants, mostly sessile, meaning they don't move on their own power anywhere, and animals, which are mostly mobile, meaning that they do move on their own power. These relationships are, of course, incredibly vital to our ecology, but not clearly well understood. The bees that we're talking about are mostly European honeybees, which you can see a lovely example right there in the upper right-hand corner, the Apis mellifera, or the bee of many flowers, and the native bees in California, which this sweat bee down here, isn't that a lovely name, sweat bee? I don't know why they call them that. And 1,600 other species of bees that live in our state. People are extremely concerned that bees are dying off. And as we often say in master gardening, yes, but it's complicated. Learn that phrase, it's complicated. It's the one you will use as a master gardener more than practically any other. Latest figures from the UCCE Society, which is an organization devoted to insects and other invertebrate animals, say that beekeepers have reported hive losses of 40% or greater over the last several years. Why is it happening? Well, a lot of ideas have been proposed, and our confused looking little bee down here is no less confused than all the people trying to figure this out. We seem to not like or value insects very much. In many places in Europe, you could live next to a cow pasture. Imagine that there were cows out in this lovely field in Tuscany and that you were living in that lovely house on that hill. You could leave your windows wide open and you would never see a fly or really much of any other insect come in your house. So many insects have been removed from the ecology in some areas that you simply don't see them. In England, we see beautiful modern houses being built with entire walls of glass that open up to view the cows in the adjacent pasture, and no one worries about getting flies or mosquitoes or anything because they simply don't exist anymore. $8.6 billion. Listen to that again. $8.6 billion were spent on structural insect control in 2018. That's not agricultural. That's mostly householders playing insect elimination companies to spray their properties because they either hate or they're afraid of bugs. Don't like spiders? Spray your house. Worried about bed bugs? Good idea. You probably should do something about that. But normal, everyday insects that we live with all our lives and haven't killed us yet are things we really shouldn't be spraying for. When you've got a real insect problem, and that can actually, I think, include ants in your house, you either should do something to eliminate that problem yourself, or you should get somebody to help you with that work. But it isn't necessary to kill each and every insect every month of the time you live in a house to keep a clean house. Insects are a normal part of our existence. Private household use of chemicals that is used to control insects, like bed bugs, are more likely to be misused by householders than they are by professional pesticide applicators, I think they're called, or by agricultural users. Something you really need to think about. We keep hearing about neonicotinoids or neonics. Neonicotinoids are a real interesting set of chemicals that comprise most of the insecticides available to private individuals in the United States, and a significant part of the insecticides available to agriculture. These were developed in the 1980s by Shell and Bayer. It's not pronounced Bayer in Germany, where the company is, it's Bayer. Imidacloprid is the most commonly used insecticide in the world. Why are they interested in these chemicals? Why did they develop all these chemicals? Because neonicotinoids, meaning it acts like nicotine, which is a powerful insecticide and will kill practically anything else in sufficient quantities, are difficult to produce and expensive. Neonicotinoids are neuroactive chemicals. They act on the nervous system of both insects, worms, and vertebrates like us and our pets. Compared to organophosphates, they cause a little less toxicity in birds and mammals because we have nervous systems that are not quite as vulnerable to taking up the neonicotinoids as some other animals like fish and insects and worms. And so these have become very popular, and people commonly believe that they are safe, but for many animals, they aren't safe. They aren't so much of a problem for European honeybees, the kind that live in boxes like the ones you see on your screen, but they're a big problem for native bees and other insect pollinators. Why are they less of a problem for honeybees? Well, honeybees live in large, complex communities with individuals doing specialized jobs. One of these jobs is where the field bees hand off, so to speak, because they actually produce the stuff from their stomachs and hand it to another bee who takes it into her little honey stomach. It's an organ inside her body. They hand off the nectar to house bees, who may then hand it off several times before it's placed into cells and dehydrated to become honey. Each time that this happens, and the process is called tophallaxis, it changes the chemical structure of the nectar, and amazingly enough, the imidacloprid or whatever neonic is picked up, and it lessens the power of that to infect the other insects. Wild bees don't do that because they don't practice tophallaxis. They just collect nectar, fan it down, and eat it, or they just eat it. The bumblebees actually do collect it, fan it down, and store it, but other bees don't do that, just honeybees and bumblebees. And so when they eat that nectar, it has a high level of the insecticide, and it either disorients them, which is the biggest problem because it affects the nervous system, or it just kills them outright. Now, neonic seed coatings are the big thing in agriculture now, really big thing. And it's a problem because the planting equipment, and you're looking at a corn planter in that slide, see the top part, the orange part with the yellow lid, that's where the seeds are. And the seeds have been dusted with neonicotinoids, and they've been kind of tossed around, get those to stick to the seeds. The seeds then fall through those little white tubes and go out into the planters. And those are those things that have got little pointy things down here in the front of the picture that actually poke down into the earth, and a little jolt of air is passed down the pipe and into those little sections and pushes the seed into the ground. What happens when it does that is it dislodges an amount of the neonicotinoid pesticide, and that is very, very detrimental to the honeybees and native pollinators because for some reason they're extremely attracted to these machines. It probably has to do with the kind of constant turning up of the soil, which creates smells that are really interesting to bees. This is a very short-lived thing in plants, the poison. It's only activated for a few days around the time of sprouting, and its only purpose is to prevent the sprout of the corn or whatever other thing is being treated, other seed is being planted, so that that sprout isn't attacked by insects or if it is, it kills the insects attacking it and slows the whole process down. So this particular process of coating seeds with these poisons is causing big problems. Now, what can we do about these problems? We can use pesticides wisely, and we advise you as master gardeners to remember not only to do this yourself, but to advise your clients to do this. Always read the label. The label has information about amount to use, when to use, and what things you're trying to kill, if it's effective on them or not. It's really important to read the labels. Dispose of extra pesticide by means suggested on the label. Some of them say you should wrap the empty bottle or in paper and then put it in a plastic bag and put it in your trash. Some of them have other suggestions. Never pour this stuff down the drain. If you have a septic system, it will cause real damage to your septic system. And if you are in city sewer, it will get into waterways and it will ultimately kill a lot more things than you ever had in mind. Don't ever use more than suggested. More is not better. For instance, we treat ant infestations with borax. And borax is highly effective against ants because you put out the borax bait, usually mixed with sugar or sugar water, and the ants come and they pick some up and they take it back to the ant bed and introduce it to their whole colonies, and it ultimately gets fed to emerging ants who are just coming out of their pupation stage, and it kills them. And what's dandy about that is it doesn't kill the ant before it goes home. It waits until the ant gets home before it kills anything. If you use more borax in your mixture, the advised amount is 5%. If you use up to 10%, which is where you normally see it sold at, it actually kills the ants on the spot and they never go home. So that ant bed continues to exist. So don't use more, it's not better. And encourage your friends, family, and community to use the least dangerous pesticide as the first situation each and every time you are confronted with a problem you need to deal with a pesticide. Least dangerous pesticides for most of the problem is water. We advise you spray your bushes that are being attacked or your plants that are being attacked with water and see if you can just knock the bugs off that way. And it's really fairly effective. And then there's a whole sequence that your master gardener advisor will be able to let you know about. So what else could be killing bees? Well, look at this bee. You see that red thing on her back there on her thorax? That's a Varroa mite. And a Varroa mite, this attractive beast in the other slide, is an enormous problem for bees all around the world except in Australia. I'll tell you about that in a minute. If you had one of these on you, it would be like having half a coconut stuck to your body. Think about what that would be like. It weakens bees. We used to think by sucking on their blood, but that turns out to not be the case. Varroa mites are after the fat in the bee's body. And bees only put fat in their bodies when they are pupating. They don't eat fats at any other time in their existence. They don't produce them biochemically. They just come with the fat they got when they were babies. And Varroa mites suck on that fat, and they reproduce about twice as fast as bees do. So they multiply very quickly. And they're hard to kill because whatever kills Varroas will very likely kill bees. And beekeepers now have to take extra steps and expense to treat her hives. All a beekeeper has to do to treat her hives for them. There are poisons that you can use that are not quite so toxic to bees. There are treatments that you can use, but all of it is expensive and all of it takes time and monitoring. You haven't lived until you've tried to scoop 100 live honeybees into a little plastic jar and shake them with alcohol and then spread them out and count how many Varroa mite you have on them. Getting those bees in that jar is just an absolute crazy amount of fun, I'll tell you. So it's expensive, it takes a lot of time. We think that Varroas probably spread some bee diseases. And quite frankly, they're just creepy little things. They look like little teeny tiny drops of blood. And we are all very sensitive to the appearance of blood. Where'd they come from? Well, they probably evolved from a mite called the Varroa jacobsoni into Varroa destructor in the Philippines in the early 1960s. And that's where it jumped into the honeybee population. In the Philippines, as in most of South Asia, they have a honeybee called Apis ceranae. It's different than our bees. They behave the same. People keep them in hives. They make honey, but they're not quite the same bees. But unfortunately, the Varroa mite didn't care, and it moved into Apis mellifera. We ended up with Apis mellifera first reported in 1987. Australia is extremely vigilant about the importation of any bee products, any bee supplies, anything having to do with honeybees. And so far, they've been able to resist getting Varroa mites. If you as a beekeeper were to go to Australia and take your own bee suit with you, they will take it away from you at customs and they burn them. So they're really vigilant. Now, another cause of great bee loss is the poor nutrition for honeybees and for other pollinators. Look at that lovely, lovely picture of almonds in bloom. The petals are just beginning to fall. The fruit is set. The almonds go on almost forever. They, in fact, do go almost on forever, as there are about 2 million plus acres of them in California. Practices that cause problems here are clean farming, elimination of cover on the edges of fields, and the extensive use of herbicides and fungicides. Notice I didn't say insecticides, herbicides and fungicides. What happens is that the minute those petals start falling off those flowers, you are looking at an absolute desert as far as bees and other pollinators are concerned. There's nothing left there of any nutritional value to them at all. They don't eat flowers, they don't eat flower petals, and they certainly don't eat almonds. They eat nectar that comes from the flower and pollen collected from the flower. So when farmers clean out all the plants underneath these trees and eliminate every living thing from the edges of the orchards, they've eliminated all the places that the insects, particularly the pollinating insects, have to get food. Herbicides, of course, are what's used to really keep everything super clean like this. And that's why those are an enemy to pollinators. And then fungicides. Normally, and unfortunately, all these trees have to be sprayed for fungus right at this petal fall moment. And they come in with these giant sprayers and drive them up and down on tractors and spray all the trees, frequently before the honeybees have been removed and taken to their next location. And fungicides cause death in bees. We know that bees, like other animals, including ourselves, have very sophisticated relationships with fungus. Funguses do all kinds of things for us, you know, beyond making blue cheese. They're pretty darn important. We couldn't live without them. But in bees, they also provide a tremendous amount of conversion of certain products like, the nectar sometimes, and sometimes the pollen, into more usable products for the bee's body to absorb. Well, what can you do about it? Well, we can encourage our farmers to plant a variety of plants on the edges of fields, plant species under orchard trees that provide pollen and nectar. We can get private gardeners to provide nectar and pollen producing plants, and we can provide available water for insects and for birds. Now, the state of California and our beloved UC has done a tremendous amount of research in coming up with the plants that are appropriate for particularly our almond farmers to plant underneath their trees, and ones that work really well to plant around the edges of their farms. If you were to drive down more into central California by Fresno and just below Fresno, just a few weeks ago, you would have seen flowers like you would never even imagine. Looks like a complete flower garden down there. And it's that way because they've encouraged the farmers to plant flowers that will bloom throughout the summer to feed the bees and feed the other pollinators. And they find that they get a much higher pollination rate on their trees when they've done so. So it's a win-win situation for everybody. These flowers and plants underneath the almond trees need to be able to be dried off in late August, early September, so that they can knock the almonds and then sweep them up to carry them away in big trucks to make lovely almond products out of them. But this is a system that works, and it's something that's been developed largely by UC and particularly UC Davis. Private gardens, now that's where we can really get in and help ourselves. So we're going to talk a bit more about that next. Insects aren't the only pollinators that require some considerations. The birds and bats are also powerful pollinators in our environment, and we need to think about them a bit too. The future, well, the corn is a lovely product, but it's not all of those things that need to be pollinated by insect or animal pollinators. In most corn, like many other grass type plants, and corn is a big giant grass, wheat, of course, those crops, those massive crops that provide tremendous amount of pure nutrition for our country and for other places in the world as well, are pollinated by the wind. And grapes, lovely grapes, are not pollinated by anything at all. They are self-fruitful. They're called calyptrous. They make flowers, yes indeed they do. They provide pollen, yes indeed they do. But they fertilize themselves before those flowers ever open. They don't require any animal intervention. Figs do that to a certain extent too. Figs do both calyptrous figs and figs that get pollinated. There could be wine and beer and there'd be crackers, but still about 3/4 of what we eat, it needs animal pollination. So next time you have wine, beer, and a little cheese, that's great, enjoy, but remember that when you want the guacamole, you've got to have animals. So let's meet the pollinators. Is that a lovely bumblebee? I love bumblebees, they're so cute. They don't sting much, they can, but they don't. And they're very charming when they bounce around from plant to plant, flower to flower. All of us love bumblebees, I think. But do you love ants? Well, ants are good pollinators. Look at the beautiful peony down there. You know that peonies won't open unless these industrious little ants over here in the other picture actually nibble away at the sepals, those green parts that cover the whole pod of the flower, until they're chewed up enough that the plant can actually force moisture up and bloom out with those beautiful petals. If you don't have ants, you don't have peonies. And those of you who've grown up with peonies, and I know many of you have, you will probably remember there are always ants in them. And there's a reason why. That's it. Next slide, please. There we go. Bats. Bats are significant pollinators of cactus and other night blooming plants. There are some beautiful night blooming morning glory type flowers. There are a lot of cactuses and they bloom at night. I'm sure you've all heard of night blooming cereus, which is a fabulous cactus flower. And they're pollinated by bats. We have in our area here the largest bat in California, and it's really tiny, I have to admit. And I'm sure you've all heard it. If you've been outside at night and you heard that high-pitched cheep, cheep, that's the largest bat in California, making little bitty bat noises to find its food. Echolocation for bats is an absolutely fascinating subject. You should look into it sometime, it's fun. Beetles. Beetles actually pollinate quite a few plants, and they're an important part of the pollination team. And besides, I really like that picture with the ladybug beetles. I think they're so cute. But notice the pollen on the one on the orange flower. Those are all beetles, and they're all busy pollinating. They're not necessarily eating things up. Bees. There's both native bees. That's the one on the right. She's sitting on honey, so it's kind of easy to tell. And the one on the left, that is a mason bee. And mason bees are really an exciting development in our understanding of how pollination can be brought to a better situation for agriculture and for home gardeners in California. We'll talk about them in a few minutes too. Come on. There, birds. Birds are pollinators, especially hummingbirds. Hummingbirds find that these long, narrow flowers, little tubular flowers, provide nutrition that is way beyond what sugar water provides. And that's because nectar is a natural product of plants produced mostly in the morning, but in a few plants in the evening, that nourishes all these different pollinators. And I think it's become a symbiotic relationship between the animals and the plant that produces the nectar. There's no really good reason for plants to make nectar other than to attract pollinators. And yet they do. They make this and it all works. And hummingbirds have their place in this process. Butterflies. Butterflies are pretty good pollinators because they move from flower to flower. And not only that, but they're so extremely beautiful. And there are other butterflies beyond the monarch. One of my favorites here is not this one, which I think is a real beauty. It's a buckeye, really beautiful butterfly. But I really like our swallowtail butterflies we have here. They're just extremely lovely. Moths. Moths come, of course, out at night, but they also come out in the daytime. And these two are the two of the larger moths that you will ever see. The one on the left is a hawk moth. They're the ones that produce tomato hornworms. I'm sure everyone's favorite caterpillar. Those things are creepy. But the one on the right is a bumblebee moth. And they kind of look like what a bumblebee would look like if it was crossed with an aircraft carrier. They really are large. They make 1.5 inches long. And they look like bees, except not quite. There's something just wonderfully different about them. And they're beautiful. Wasps. I know, none of us really like wasps. We particularly don't like those ones that want to get in our dinner and crawl around on our hamburger and sting our children and make our lives miserable. But wasps have their place as well. I have a friend who has a greenhouse, and every summer it gets wasp nests in it. And you really can't go in there because they'll chase you around. But he said he thinks they're enormously effective pollinators in his garden. And he wouldn't destroy the greenhouse wasp nests until fall for anything because he thinks they're so effective. What can you see about wasps that's really distinctive? If you look at that wasp, you'll see that its markings are very sharp and crisp. And most bees, but most especially honeybees, have very soft and indistinct transitions between one color and another. So if you're wondering, is it a bee or a wasp, you might look at how sharp the colors lines are. Now, how can you have your own bee protection system? This is sort of like the Federal Witness Protection System, only it's the bee protection system. And we're going to give you some hints on how to be part. 1, choose a diversity of floral hosts for your garden. You should have at least 20. And if you have some really attractive plants, and we'll give you some clues on what some of those are in a minute, you can have fewer than 20, but you need to replace your spring annuals with summer annuals because summer is a very hard time for bees, particularly in our area, when from about the 15th of June until the 1st of September, there is very little out there for bees to eat. And so if you can provide flowers that bloom in the summer, that's a real step up for the bees. Overlap your flowering seasons. Look first to trees. Trees and rosemary. Rosemary begins blooming in late December, early January. Great bee fodder. My bees love it. Everyone else I know's bees really love it. Every spring we see a flurry of interest on our Facebook page where people say, how come my bees have all this gray stuff all over them? Well, it's because it's rosemary pollen and it's kind of purplish gray. And they just get into it and they get covered in it. They look like they've been dusted with flour. Select things that have opening times from February until October and look for both pollen and nectar. Look to trees and bushes for your early spring. Manzanita is a great bee fodder plant. Various kinds of trees have blossoms, and some of them are not really even very obvious. And this does not include oak trees, which don't provide honeybees with much, but a lot of trees will provide you some good options, and they're so beautiful. Cherry trees, for instance, are just stunningly beautiful. The ornamental ones as well as the fruit ones. So look for overlapping times between the seasons so you have flowers pretty much all the time. I know you'd like that too, because I like flowers all the time. Design your yard with structure. Remember the tallest plants in the back and the short ones near the front? Choose plants that fit the space. If your plants have a whole bunch of big tall ones in the front, or big tall ones that overlap your short ones, it's harder for the bees to get into them and they won't utilize them. So arrange your garden beds in a sensible way. I say, for us, sensible is tall in the back, short in the front. If you want to do it the other way around, have tall in the front, short in the back, that's up to you, but you won't see everything. The bees won't care. It works out nicely for them. They just want stuff divided out a bit. Plant your plants in the sun. Bees prefer to visit plants that are in the sun. Avoid planting your bee-attractive plants in the shadier areas of your garden. If you want to have bees and have happy bees, have plants that have sun on them in the morning when the nectar is pushed up from the plant, and sun helps this process along and keeps it going until the early afternoon. By early afternoon, the bees will have transitioned from collecting nectar to collecting water. And so you will see them on plants in the afternoon, especially in the late afternoon. But there's a period in the day there when collecting water in the heat of the summer is way more important than anything else. So plant things out in the sun. Bees will like that better. Plant herbaceous, shrubs, perennials, and annuals in patches or rows or any place where they're contiguous to one another. An ideal patch, and that's the smallest size, is 3.5 feet by 3.5 feet. But that can be squeezed out into a long strip. It doesn't have to be exactly 3 by 5 by 3 by 5. You can make it into a long strip, 8 inches wide, and as long as whatever that would work out to. Just so long as the plant type with the blooming thing at the same time is happening at the same time. And that's because bees are preferential feeders. They want to get all the nectar from one kind of plant and all the pollen from one kind of plant. And they will get their sisters to go to those plants as long as there's food there. And then they'll move on to something else. I have people call me up all the time who are going, but I planted such and such and my bees are all over on this other plant. Well, they don't read the book and they don't care what you plant. They're going to get what they want. And we've looked at research and said what they want is stuff that's planted this way. My husband says European honeybees are obviously European because they use metric, because this is about 1 meter by 1 meter square. So be sure to plant your plants in the metric configuration at the minimum for plants. If you put in marigolds, put in that many marigolds. If you put in, salvias, put in that many salvias, which could be 1. If you put in pretty much anything, put it in a spot about that big or put in enough to accomplish that. With most bushy things like salvias, you can get away with 3 of them and that will be all you need in 1 meter. Seed annuals early so that you get development. That means flowers, basically. Scratch the surface, sprinkle on the seeds, cover the seeds with some compost and water gently. This is the great directions for planting California poppies, by the by, which are a lovely bee fodder and will bloom into the summer if you keep watering them a bit. Deadhead your flowers, do flower maintenance. Not only deadheading them, but when you pull that flower, the dried flower off, rub it between your hands and just let the seeds drop to the ground where you got it. And that will cause more of those things to come up in that space later. You're just reseeding just like nature would, but you're doing it in a more effective way so that bees don't have to work to look all over that flower that's got nothing for them before they make a decision to move on. Make it easier for your bees. Deadhead your flowers. Water regularly. Don't overdo it, but water regularly. We need to have strong plants in order to make flowers, and strong plants require some water. Don't use pesticides in your bee garden. Look for natural remedies like water or diatomaceous earth or whatever you can find on the IPM website from the University of California. Look for some ways to take care of that. Woo, we're moving ahead too quickly. Consider planting in your climate zones. Look at the new Sunset Western Garden book, and they have beautiful maps, and those maps are very, very detailed, and they will point out to you that the Bay Area is not the same as the foothills. The foothills have our own requirements, our own difficulties, and our own temperatures. And things that grow here are not necessarily the plants that you would have brought from the Bay Area should you have come from there, or found them beautiful in that area, which we certainly all have, but they don't always work here. So consider your plant climate zones and look plants up before you get around to planting them. Don't plant anything underneath the base of oak trees that's not already there. And don't scrape away all the leaves from the base of your oak tree. Your oak tree needs those leaves to protect the soil around its roots. A totally bare area around the base of an oak tree is just as bad as watering them all summer long. You need to leave the leaves alone and let them just molder where they are. They are protecting the soil. They are providing habitat for the insects that are actually necessary to the oak tree, and they will ultimately provide food for the fungus that helps keep the oak tree alive. Not destroying it, but keeping it alive, because there's a very sophisticated relationship between fungus and the way oak trees eat, absorb nutrients through the soil. Don't forget nesting bees that nest in your ground. Please leave some areas in your garden uncultivated. Don't dig them up and don't walk over them all the time. A stepping stone pathway with a little bit of dirt between them could provide an attractive zone for soil nesting bees, like bumblebees, which do nest in the soil. Look for, and you can look into constructing native bee nests or habitat for native bees to nest in. And here's a way to do it. There's over 350 different species of, no, actually there's over 1,600 different native species, but 300 native bees in 350 different kinds of native bees in California. You can make a place for some of those by using one of these little bamboo structures where bees of certain kinds, mostly not leafcutter bees. Oh, well, I'll come to it in a second here.
Carpenter?
What?
Is it carpenter bees?
Carpenter bees are too fat for this. They have to have a little bit bigger holes. I'm thinking of mason bees.
Okay.
And we have a lot of species of mason bees here, and they come in several different sort of subspecies. Real interesting mason bees. But these little holes in the bamboo, because they're different sizes, will be attractive to different kinds. And they will nest in them all summer. The female bee will lay her eggs. They will pupate. They will hatch out. They will make more bees, and it goes on. And then in the fall, she does a very clever thing. She puts mud over the front of where she's laid her eggs. And that mud is why we call them mason bees, because they build these little mud structures. And that protects the baby bees until next spring when they hatch out. A lot of people will actually take these little bee houses in and protect them for the winter and then run them right out in the springtime so that they can be, they can emerge and be right there in their native habitat where they want to be. Remember that dirt is important, and remember that these little bee houses are a lot of fun and can be very helpful. There's directions online to build them with your children. It's a great project, and you can do them with a tin can and a few pieces of bamboo and a string, and they're real cute and work well. So, about the insects in your yard. I know insects are creepy, I know. Most of these insects in your yard aren't causing any problems. Their presence is adding to your ecology, not detracting. If they aren't chewing up everything in sight, they're probably not anything you need to worry about. For example, let's look at the earwig. Everyone I know hates earwigs. And incidentally, unless you sleep on the ground a lot, they're incredibly unlikely to ever go in your ear. I just can't imagine sleeping there long enough to encourage an earwig, because that takes a long time. Notice that this earwig in the picture has kind of little pincers on the back end of it. Do you know what that tells us about the earwig? It's a boy. Girl earwigs have straighter apparatus in the back of them, and they're shorter than the boy's pincers. They actually use those to hold on to things. The girls don't have any holder-oners. They just have to hang on with their legs. Apple farmers actually encourage earwigs by wrapping up newspaper into little tubes, collecting earwigs and putting them in apple trees, because earwigs actually eat some small pests of apples. they're good at eating small insects. Now the next one over is a border plant bug. It's got a border on it. Can you see a little tiny orangish border? They're closely related to box elder bugs, which not only have the border, but also have an orange X on their backs. And next to those is a picture of those little shiny, really shiny, almost blue-black insects. Those actually are baby border plant bugs. They're called instars. They're the various stages of growth that come along with becoming a big plant bug. And they too will get all over in your garden, and they look totally terrifying and awful. They don't really eat much. If you have problems with them, again, I'd suggest you wash them off with the hose. It's the best way to deal with them. But they aren't a separate insect. They're just border plant bugs. So your garden can support many creatures and bring much delight to you, like honeybees, native bees, other insect pollinators, birds, and bats. If you encourage them and are careful to provide habitat for them, you will attract them to your garden and be able to enjoy them. Here's some books that are helpful. California Bees in Blooms is a great book. It was developed by Heyday Books and the University of California program, and it's available on the UC site if you order books through them, and you can also get it at your local bookstore. It's a good one. It has plans. It has diagrams for creating different kinds of gardens. It has a huge selection of information on each individual kind of wild bee you would ever imagine. It's a really nice book. These are other places to get information. Be Informed, the Xerces Society, the Honeybee Health Coalition, and Pollinator Partnership. I want to point out something that Pollinator Partnership has, and that's this book right here. This is available for download on their website, and it is a comprehensive list of plants for different situations that work in our area. They divide you up by area. Our area in the foothills here is the Sierran Steppe area. The book is blue. Be careful about printing it. It will eat up your blue ink cartridge really fast because the whole book is blue inside. Blue, everywhere blue. But they have these great lists of different kinds of plants and butterflies and how things work here. And you can choose by color or a height or how much water they take. And they have these very extensive lists, which I'm sure you can't read, but if you download it, you can. Great resource. If you want to know what to plant, when to plant, for what you want to achieve in terms of supporting pollinators, it's a great resource. So and there it is. And that's where to order it, pollinator.org. Real simple, real straightforward. So I have a couple others. I know we're getting down to thank you and happy gardening, but I have a couple other books to look at. One of these is a Xerces book called Attractive Native Pollinators. Again, it's a really good book with lots of lists and things to consider, and it tells you how to build mason bee houses and how to provide other situations for other native pollinators to live in. Here's a book on the orchard mason bee. This book will tell you all about the orchard mason bee. A charming bee. They don't sting. They're really cute, and they really do a good job pollinating. In fact, there is an orchard mason bee that was being used here in California for a while, and now it got a little expensive to produce, so they're not doing it, called the blue orchard bee. The blue orchard bee could pollinate about 5 times whatever a honeybee could in the same amount of time. And they are being actually bred in greenhouses just to do that with almonds. Here's a book called Pollinator Friendly Gardening. It's a really nice book. Has lots of beautiful pictures, information, lists, list plants by color. Victory Garden for Bees. I think this one's a very nice book. Everyone I know likes this book a lot. People borrow it from the Bee Association all the time, so I know they like it. It actually has some really good stuff on planting trees as well. So those are just a few books you might consider looking into. And 100 Plants to Feed the Bees. This is a really, really good book. It applies to our area as well as the rest of the country. They have maps to show you where this plant occurs and where it's being planted, and they tell you all about them. And this one is a real beauty. This one is from Storybooks, and 100 Plants to Feed the Bees. Great book. So that's it. Thank you for allowing me to talk to you, and happy gardening. And yes, indeed, those are my beehives right at the end of that picture. Thank you. Bye.